Welcome back to Celeb News. The fall of Mayor Tiffany Henyard emails. Secret recordings. A courtroom packed with journalists, residents, and lawyers. The web of bribery, backdoor deals, and taxpayer-funded luxuries finally caught up to Mayor Tiffany Henyard, shattering the image she so carefully constructed. Once hailed as the unstoppable super mayor of Dalton and supervisor of Thornton Township, Henyard's public persona, smooth-talking, confident, and seemingly unassailable, was torn apart as damning evidence revealed the truth behind her rise to power. Her face had once graced billboards across the city, symbolizing hope and transformation. But on this day, in the harsh lighting of a packed courtroom, that same face was pale, drained of color, and frozen in disbelief. The air was heavy with anticipation as the prosecution presented emails, financial records, and secret recordings that exposed a pattern of corruption. Inflated salaries, taxpayer-funded shopping sprees, questionable payments, and efforts to intimidate whistleblowers of residents of Dalton, many of whom had once cheered Henyard on as a trailblazer, sat in stunned silence. The woman they had trusted to lead them was now exposed as a fraud. The courtroom buzzed with disbelief, grief, and anger. Then, the silence shattered in a fit of fury. Henyard slammed her fist on the table, the force loud enough to make her chair screech against the polished courtroom floor. She stood, trembling with rage, and shouted, "This is a setup." Her voice cracked, echoing through the chamber. All eyes turned toward her. The judge's gavel pounded for order, but Henyard wasn't finished pointing a shaking finger at the prosecution. She bellowed, "This is political. You don't want a strong woman." The irony hung heavy in the air. Here stood a leader accused of bullying city officials, manipulating budgets, and treating public funds like a personal bank account, now claiming victimhood. It was classic Henyard: deflect, dramatize, and frame herself as the underdog, even as her empire of deception crumbled around her in a desperate attempt to regain control. She turned on her legal team. "You were supposed to handle this," she hissed, her voice dripping with contempt. One attorney shuffled through a stack of papers, red-faced and shaken, while the other avoided her gaze entirely for the first time in her career. Henyard had no spin, no control, and nowhere to run. The truth had caught up to her. Then came the moment that would be replayed on news channels across the country. Henyard, seething with frustration, grabbed her designer handbag, ripped off her microphone, and stormed out of the courtroom. Gasps filled the room. Reporters scrambled to their feet, snapping photos and chasing after her as chaos erupted behind her. Court officers shouted for order. The audience, residents who had been lied to, silenced, and dismissed, burst into applause. Justice, it seemed, had finally arrived outside the courthouse. The scene was no less chaotic. Henyard's heels clicked furiously against the pavement as she made her way down the steps, flanked by her security detail. Reporters surged forward, microphones in hand. "Mayor Henyard, do you have a comment on the leaked recordings? Is it true that millions of taxpayer dollars are unaccounted for? Will you resign?" After days, hearing Henyard remained silent, her jaw clenched, eyes straight ahead. Her expression was hard, defiant. The calm, charismatic mayor the public once knew had vanished, replaced by someone who looked cornered, wounded, and dangerously close to unraveling. Then, just as she approached the black SUV waiting to whisk her away, a voice cut through the crowd. "You think you can run from this now?" Tiffany, a woman, stepped forward, blocking her path. It was a former treasurer of Dalton, once a quiet bureaucrat, now an outspoken critic who had resigned months earlier, citing corruption and financial misconduct in Henyard's administration. Her resignation had been brushed off by Henyard as disgruntled bitterness. But now, she stood firm, her eyes burning with resolve. "You silence all of us," she said, voice steady and sharp. "But guess what? You can run out of court, but you can't run from the truth for a moment." Henyard froze. The mayor who once wielded unchecked power seemed small, exposed, stripped of her authority. The cameras captured every second. Reporter leaning in, sensing that they were witnessing the final chapter in a political downfall of historic proportions. Attention crackled as the two women locked eyes. One had built an empire. The other had walked away from it, unwilling to be complicit. Now, the tables had turned inside the courtroom. Henyard's inner circle sat paralyzed. Phones buzzed nonstop, and staffers whispered urgently, but no one had a plan. Their leader had abandoned the fight. Some scrambled to make statements, while others quietly slipped away, hoping not to be caught in the fallout. Henyard's attempt to control the narrative had failed. Earlier that week, she had taken to Facebook in a fiery live video, accusing critics of trying to bring down a powerful black woman doing the work. She portrayed herself as the victim of a smear campaign, insisting the system was afraid of her strength. But the public wasn't buying it. The media dubbed the video a meltdown in real time. Community members called it manipulative and tone-deaf. Her once loyal base had begun to erode, and even her most ardent defenders were reconsidering their support. What remained was a bitter portrait of a political career that had begun with promise but ended in disgrace. Her earlier years had inspired hope. Rising through the ranks, Henyard had seemed to embody a new era of leadership, bold, unapologetic, and focused on transformation. But over time, that promise gave way to entitlement. The fiscal recklessness, the bullying, the secrecy, it all painted a picture of a leader who had lost away millions in taxpayer money were now unaccounted for. Community development funds had been misused. Projects promised were either delayed or abandoned. Meanwhile, salaries for top officials in her administration mysteriously ballooned, with little to show for it now, amid a growing FBI investigation, possible indictments, and increasing calls for resignation. Henyard's political future seemed all but over. Her empire of power, once built on charisma and control, had collapsed under the weight of its corruption still. She tried to keep the mask in place. In interviews, she dodged questions. In public appearances, she remained combative. But the cracks had deepened beyond repair, and the people of Dalton had seen enough outside the courthouse. The confrontation ended as suddenly as it had begun. Henyard pushed past the former treasurer and climbed into her car. The door slammed shut behind her, but not before one last voice shouted from the crowd, "This is what happens when you mess with the people's money." The vehicle sped away. Chased by flashing cameras and a storm of unanswered questions back inside, the courtroom slowly emptied. Reporters filed their stories. Residents shared knowing glances. The era of Tiffany Henyard was ending, not with a celebration, but with a lesson. One is about trust, accountability, and what happens when power becomes a weapon rather than a responsibility. What began as a career built on ambition, strength, and the hope of change ended in disgrace, scandal, and betrayal. The fall of Tiffany Henyard was more than a political collapse. It was a reckoning, and Dalton would never forget the fall of Tiffany Henyard. The moment truth spoke louder, you can't silence the truth, the former treasurer declared, her voice rising boldly as the cameras clicked and streamed every second live. The crowd around her surged, pressure mounting. Tiffany Henyard, once unshakable, stood visibly uncomfortable, hesitating to turn away. Then, in a flash of impulsive recklessness, Henyard stepped forward, inches from the former treasurer's face. She muttered something low, threatening, venomous. But what she hadn't realized, in her typical bravado, was that the moment had been caught live. The treasurer smirked, turned to the crowd of reporters, and said loud enough for the world to hear, "You heard that right. She just threatened me." Again, social media exploded instantly. Hashtags trended within seconds. Hashtag Henyard exposed. Hashtag Dalton deserves better. The world watched in real time as Mayor Tiffany Henyard's political empire unraveled before their eyes. The carefully curated image of the iron-fisted super mayor collapsed in a matter of moments inside the courthouse. The hearing continued without her. Gone were the whispered backdoor deals and suppressed audio recordings. Without Henyard there to control the narrative, the prosecution laid it all bare. The truth wasn't just damaging. It was devastating. A staggering $30 million in financial discrepancies came to light. Gasps echoed across the courtroom as the prosecution's case deepened. "Your Honor," the lead attorney said with deliberate gravity, "we have uncovered a series of financial transactions totaling over $30 million. The silence that followed was deafening. This wasn't just mismanagement. This was embezzlement, fake invoices, shell companies, mysterious consulting fees." The prosecution clicked through a parade of damning documents. Then came the most shocking revelation yet. Many of those transactions weren't even tied to Dalton. They were connected to luxury real estate investments in other states, funded with money meant for the town, schools, infrastructure, and safety programs. The question lingered. Who owned those properties? When the answer came, the courtroom reeled. Henyard's inner circle, her top advisors, even her boyfriend, who had conspicuously vanished from public view, was implicated in property ownership. There was no longer any space for speculation. This wasn't incompetence. It was deliberate criminal activity, intentional, corrupt, and Henyard wasn't even present to defend herself. Then came the judge's announcement. Monumental, measured. Final, it is within the court's authority to authorize an official criminal investigation into Mayor Henyard's financial dealings. The gavel struck. Gasps and murmurs spread through the courtroom. What had once been rumors was now a federal matter. The people of Dalton, who had whispered in grocery aisles, held town hall whispers in hushed tones, and dared not speak too loudly, were now witnessing the justice they'd been denied for years outside the courthouse. A crowd erupted as news of the investigation reached them. "Lock her up. We finally got her." They roared. It was a celebration, yes, but one stained with years of anger and betrayal. This wasn't just about corruption. It was about a community gaslight for too long. Meanwhile, Henyard sat just a few blocks away, completely unaware of the fallout crashing down inside. Still cocooned in delusion, she believed she could manipulate the story, cast herself as a victim, and play the gender card. Again, but reality was closing and her phone buzzed. One of her closest advisors was on the line. She answered with a curt, what the voice on the other end was frantic. Madam Mayor, it's bad. Real bad. She held her breath. And then came the words that sealed her fate. It's federal. They're coming after you. Her stomach dropped. This wasn't political fallout anymore. It was a full-blown criminal case. She couldn't spin this. No talking point would save her now. The texts and calls kept coming. But she didn't answer. She couldn't. The tapes, the leaks, the evidence. It was overwhelming. The empire she had built through intimidation and deceit was collapsing brick by brick, and there was nothing she'd do to stop inside the courtroom. The judge's ruling confirmed what many had feared and hoped. For a criminal investigation was officially underway. The crowd outside roared louder. Some waved signs. Others cried. It was catharsis. Justice wasn't just being served. It was finally being acknowledged, and then, as if the drama couldn't escalate further, a whistleblower came forward. Someone from Henyard's own office. I worked in that office for years. The woman said during a live TV interview, her voice shaking with raw emotion. I saw how the money moved. I saw where it went. And when I tried to speak up, I was threatened. Threatened by who? The interviewer asked. Wide-eyed, the answer was obvious. The final nail in Henyard's political coffin had come from inside her administration, inside her car. She sat paralyzed. Her empire had crumbled. She had no spin left, no narrative to twist. Her face, once plastered across billboards as a symbol of resilience, was now the face of public betrayal. The media had stopped calling her a powerhouse. They now called her something else, a fugitive from justice. And for the first time in her political life, Tiffany Henyard was truly, undeniably alone. Here's your rewritten passage in approximately 219 words, refined for clarity, drama, and emotional pacing, while preserving the power of the original, the reckoning of Tiffany Henyard. Justice at last. The people of Dalton, long silenced under Tiffany Henyard's iron grip, were finally witnessing justice unfold. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted into celebration. Decades of frustration, fear, and whispered accusations had given way to defiant chants calling for her imprisonment. As their voices echoed through the streets, they reached her like a haunting drumbeat sitting in her car. Just blocks away, Henyard felt the weight of her past pressing in. Her phone buzzed incessantly, calls, messages, misalerts. But she couldn't bring herself to answer. She didn't need to. She already knew. The truth was out. The charges were coming. And there was no narrative left to control federal charges. The phrase rang in her ears like a death knell for years. Tiffany Henyard had been the most powerful figure in Dalton. She ruled through fear, manipulation, and unchecked authority. She bullied whistleblowers, intimidated dissenters, and painted herself as a victim whenever she was challenged. Her reign was absolute, or so it seemed now. Everything had changed. The woman who once stood untouchable sat alone, the panic rising in her chest, matching the cheers rising outside. Her so-called empire, built on deception, backdoor deals, and corruption, was crumbling with breathtaking speed. Her grip on power had vanished. And for the first time in her life, Henyard was a fugitive from justice. Her once loyal inner circle had scattered. Staffers who'd followed her orders without question were nowhere to be found. Even the police officers who had served as her personal security detail were now law enforcement agents waiting for the green light to act. Not to protect her, but to arrest her. Her lawyer sat in the passenger seat, eyes downcast. The same attorney who had stood by her through countless scandals now refused to meet her gaze. The silence between them said what words could not. Even he knew it was over. And her boyfriend, the man who had been a constant presence at her side through photo ops and press conferences, was gone. No texts, no calls, no explanation. Tiffany Henyard had burned too many bridges. And now, when she needed someone, anyone, there was no one left. Her heart pounded in her chest as her phone continued to vibrate in her hand. She stared at the screen, but couldn't bring herself to answer. What was the point? She knew what was waiting on the other end. Confirmation that the investigation was expanding, that the authorities were coming for everything. They're coming after everything, she whispered to herself. Everything: the hidden accounts, the luxury properties, the offshore transfers, the fake consulting firms. All of it was under a microscope now. The feds weren't just looking for a political scapegoat. They were building a case, a real one, and she was at the center of it. Panic crashed into her like a wave. She looked around the car, searching for something, an escape plan, a lifeline, anything. But there was no one left to help her across town. Cable news stations were running live coverage of the scandal. Headlines screamed across screens: bombshell. Henyard under federal investigation, full financial probe into Dalton corruption. FBI now involved, then came to twist no one, not even Henyard, saw coming a whistleblower. From inside her administration, I worked in that office for years, the woman said, her voice trembling as she sat across from a stunned interviewer. I saw how the money moved, how taxpayer dollars were funneled into private accounts. And when I tried to speak up, I was threatened. The interviewer leaned forward, threatened by who the answer was clear. Tiffany Henyard's world, once carefully protected by lies and intimidation, was unraveling live on national television. The whistleblower held up a small recorder, revealing that Henyard herself had issued direct threats to silence anyone who got in her way. The recording, long rumored, was real and damning. Back in the courthouse, the prosecution wasted no time. With the whistleblower's testimony added to the mountain of financial evidence, they filed for a full investigation. The judge granted on the spot. The courtroom buzzed with disbelief, astonishment, and, finally, vindication for the resident of Dalton who had lived in fear for years. It was more than a legal victory. It was a moral one. Outside, the chants grew louder. Signs waved in the air. Some wept. Others cheered until their voices cracked. It was the justice they had waited for. And now it was happening. Then came the first arrest, not Henyard herself, but her top financial advisor, a high-ranking official who had managed the city's funds and had been by Henyard's side for years. The arrest was swift, public, and symbolic. More were expected. The walls were closing in, and the real shock followed. The FBI was officially involved. The case had gone fully federal. Henyard's body tensed as the implications hit. The FBI wasn't just conducting interviews. They were issuing subpoenas, freezing assets, flipping insiders. This was the real deal. She turned to her lawyer, her voice tight and trembling. Fix this, but he didn't speak. He didn't promise. He wasn't reassured. He simply looked at her, his silence a cold confirmation that there was no fixing this. Tiffany Henyard, once the most feared woman in Dalton, was no longer in control. She wasn't writing the story anymore. She wasn't the narrator. She was the subject, the accused. The target. The crowd outside chanted louder, their voices echoing to the streets and bouncing off buildings she once entered with pride. Her name, once a brand, was now a punchline, a warning, a fall from grace so spectacular the entire nation was watching. She sat frozen in her car, numb. The woman who had deceived and manipulated her way to power, who had ruled without accountability, now sat on the brink of collapse, powerless to stop what was coming. This wasn't just a PR crisis. It was the end. The investigation was far from over. With the FBI digging deeper, more arrests were expected. Former allies were already flipping, trading testimony for lighter sentences. Every move she had made, every dollar misused, every lie spun. It was all being tracked, recorded, and unraveled now. Only one question remained. Would Tiffany Henyard cut a deal to save herself? Or would she make one final, desperate attempt to run? The people of Dalton were watching. The world was watching, and this time, there was no hiding, no spinning, no escaping. The truth had come for her, and justice was no longer waiting.